Okay, so when setting up your scenes, the first thing you're going to need to do is make sure that main camera that's initially added to the scene is deleted. Now I've started with by simply adding my prefab of my terrain into the scene. And if you're using layer hiding, then you may have a scene that's already configured this way, in which this root object is set to the unbound tag and all your objects in your scene, or maybe only the root object, are set to this hidden layer. First thing we're going to need to do is change that so that that hidden layer is no longer used. Now if you've determined that your scenes are fixed, then this setup right here is perfectly fine. You've got your terrain object as your root object in the scene, and it's set to the unbound tag. At this point you're ready to go ahead and save. And we want to save our scene with the same name as our root object. And then we want to go to our build settings and add that scene to it. So we can choose add current, or we can simply drag the scene onto the window. If your scenes are not fixed, you will need to use a deactivated node. In order to do that, we need to add a new game object, which will serve as the new root object. So we're going to name it the same as our old root object. We're going to set its tag to the unbound tag, and then we need to set its position to the position of the old root object. Then we can parent the old root object to this object, and then deactivate that object, and that old root object will now be used as the deactivated node. Of course, you don't have to use this object as the deactivated node. You could create another child, simply an empty game object. And then parent everything else to it. And indeed, if you had a situation where, let's say this sphere here wasn't parented to your terrain, instead it was just something like that. Well, we can't do this, because then we wouldn't have a deactivated node. In that case, you will want to have a deactivated node that's simply an empty game object. It really doesn't matter how deep this terrain is in your hierarchy, as long as you have no other terrains. If you have another terrain in that hierarchy, then you will need to make sure that that base terrain that you're using as your base object in the world is higher up in the hierarchy than the other terrain. And this is because internally I use getComponent and children to find that terrain in order to properly configure it for terrain neighboring. And that uses depth first searching, so it's going to find the first terrain and use it. Now you also notice that our terrain is named the same as our root object, which is perfectly fine. The only thing that matters with naming is that root object's name. All these other names can be whatever you want. One last thing, we also need to make sure to change our former root object's tag back to untagged, or whatever tag we want. We don't want to set it to unbound though, because that will add additional objects to the search using find game objects with tag. And actually, if our names are the same, that's going to throw some errors, so make sure to set this tag so that it's not the unbound tag. Okay, that should cover manual setup of the scene. In the next video, we're going to be going over how to use the scene generation tool.